Welcome to our annual Gandhi Lecture at the South Asian Studies Council. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Praveen Bhatt and the Bhatt family for continuing to support this lecture and South Asian Studies at Yale. The lecture on today, this time on Gandhi's birthday, is a moment for us to reflect on the life and work of Mahatma Gandhi and the lessons one can draw from it. I'm particularly delighted to welcome Feroz Nowrojee back to Yale. And in many ways, Feroz is perhaps exemplifies several of the features of Gandhi's life and career. Gandhi started out as a lawyer. He first went to Bombay and was faced with a lack of success in the courts. In his biography, he talks about how his voice dried up and he couldn't speak. And in a way, he left for South Africa in search of greener pastures, representing the first generation of Indian professionals who were migrating to Africa. Gandhi's career in South Africa moved from that of a commercial lawyer to being someone who spoke increasingly about the interests of the Indians who employed him, and then more broadly about the wider community of Indians, and later on about other populations as well. In some ways, Gandhi was the first colored lawyer in Africa, and he fought to get admitted before the bar, and many of those challenges come from the experience of being someone who moves between two worlds, representing his clients, but also his race in the courtroom. It is indeed a pleasure to bring Feroz in the year 2017, the year he completes 50 years of practice in the court of Kenya. Feroz is an advocate in the High Court of Kenya, and the High Court of Tanzania, and the High Court of Zanzibar. He has also practiced in Uganda and the Seychelles. His education reflects this sort of diversity of sites. He studied in Bombay, in London at the bar at Lincoln's Inn, and in New Haven at Yale Law School, where he did his LL.M. in 1974. Feroz's legal practice spans several years, but I wanted to highlight a series of matters he got involved in from the 1980s onwards, where he sort of became the face of the lawyer for the pro-democracy movement in Kenya that was struggling against one-party dictatorship and authoritarianism. He appeared in numerous cases defending opposition politicians, newspapers, and investigating cases of governmental corruption. And for his work, he has been recognized in multiple forums. He was given the International Commission of Jurists Award for the year 1995. He received the Bernard Simons Human Rights Prize. He was on the Law Society of Kenya Roll of Honor. The Indian government gave him the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman in 2007, and the Maasai People gave him the Safeguarding Rights Award also in 2007. Gandhi's the other role was that of a writer and a publicist. And starting from his days in South Africa, he wrote extensively, both as a correspondent to individuals through letters, but published and wrote a number of magazines, newspapers, and created a kind of vibrant mode of discussion. Feroz himself has a long career as a writer, journalist, and a publicist. His span of writings range from works on human rights in Africa, on the role of the press and media freedom, on detailed commentary on political affairs in Kenya and other parts of Africa, and as well as literary interests in fiction and poetry. Gandhi's ideas also were not just that of a liberal lawyer in a courtroom, but at a certain point of time also began to challenge the entire framework of liberal legality. In some ways, he makes a break from the idea of the law in Hind Swaraj, where he sort of condemns the law, medicine, and railways as instruments that support colonial rule. In some ways, Feroz's own career shows both reflects someone who acts through the framework of human rights, but is also careful and critical of many of the assumptions that undergird its framework. And this comes through several of his conversations and interviews that are available online. So for instance, when there were claims that multi-party democracy arrived in Africa in the 1990s as a result of ending of the Cold War, he pointed out that this ignores a very long struggle that exists within Africa for democracy and for representative institutions, going right back to the founding of the African National Congress in the early 20th century. Similarly, he pointed out that you cannot run human rights activism based only on foreign aid. It is something that has to grow indigenously, it has something that has to develop local roots, and it has to become a principle of lived fairness and not just seminars that are run out of tells. Lastly, Feroz plays a really important role in thinking about the role of Asians in Africa. I am hesitant to describe Feroz as an Indian lawyer because what he is an African lawyer. As we in the United States grapple around the question of what it means to be a hyphenated identity, I think Feroz's life and experiences tell us what it is to sort of reverse the hyphen in another part of the world. Feroz has played a critical role in documenting the history of South Asians in East Africa. He has been the head of the Asian African Heritage Trust and curated a sort of path-breaking exhibition on the Asian diaspora in Africa. He's the author of several important works of history, including one of the first biographies of Pio Gama Pinto, the sort of Goan revolutionary who was part of the Kenyan national struggle. Most recently, I mean, in Feroz's sort of stellar career, Feroz was in the news as the lawyer appearing before the Kenyan Supreme Court, representing Raila Odinga and other opposition parties, where he managed to convince the court to successfully overturn the recent results of the presidential election and order new elections. In some ways, it's a historic moment. It's happened only 3 times in world history. Kenya is the most recent one. Feroz, welcome back to Yale. We very much look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks. Dr. Pravin Bhatt, members of the Bhatt family, the Council of the South Asian Studies Council, Harry, the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies, Professor Day. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being back. The title of the lecture is, and it's a descriptive title, Gandhi and Kenya from 1919 to 1929. And it was subtitled An Unlikely Theatre of Operations for Gandhi. This period, 1919 to 1929, is a pivotal period in Gandhi's career. It was in this decade that he changed from a diasporic hero, leading a struggle for equal rights and equal treatment of Indians abroad as subjects in the empire and against white supremacists in South Africa, into an Indian leader of a struggle for the independence of India and the end of colonialism. Kenya was an unlikely field for this transformation. In the early 1980s, I was given a photograph of Gandhi in Zanzibar. And my curiosity and reading took me forward to his return to India, 1915, and a search for the retention of any ties with the continent, that's Africa. In 1919, it was a time for the clarification of his own political objectives and those of the Indian National Congress, beginning to bring into focus a direction for 300 million people. And then in that search, within the Khilafat movement, within the prospect of an intended satyagraha, in the aftermath of the Indigo Satyagraha, the ending of the indentured labors, this is all between 1917, 1919, and so on, he saw also a political opportunity emerge in Kenya. Now, Kenya was then classic Gandhi terrain. Indian settlers, white supremacist rule, oppressive legislation, exclusionary policies, official humiliation of Indians, the distant emperor's repeated concern for all his subjects, in that he considered that he should take up the fight for equal rights for Indians in Kenya, as he had in Natal and the Transvaal. But there was another and a more important reason. To understand this interest in Kenya, hitherto absent in Gandhi, one must recall that the main political issue in India at this time was not independence. It was the push for equal rights for Indians while remaining subjects of the empire. So in the same year, 1919, for example, Gandhi was asked to write a new constitution for the Indian National Congress. In his draft of the proposed constitution, he set out the Congress's goal, and it was Swaraj within the empire. India's expectations in this regard were heightened by the huge part it played in the defense of the empire in the recently ended war. 1.25 million Indian troops took part in the First World War. This involvement was not less than the lauded Canadian, Australian, and South African dominions, that of those dominions, and thus India's demand was for similar dominion status within the empire. That it also had helped to end the conflict victoriously. Reforms to constitutional advance and in the franchise as well were sought, which would move India towards self-government and equal treatment within India. Gandhi was not in disagreement with these goals, but on the issue of the priority attaching to Congress's objectives. He considered the main issue to be, amongst all these, to be the equality of the treatment of Indians in British territories outside India. Gandhi considered that redress through other aims, through Swaraj, through dominion status, through the constitutional reforms, would be, and I quote, a pious hope, doomed to disappointment unless ignorance is replaced at the center by wisdom and apathy by sympathy for the claims of Indians living in His Majesty's dominions outside India. Gandhi kept raising the question of the status of Indians in South Africa at that time, just at the beginning of 1919, as, quote again, as a matter of no small importance. And finally, an editorial in the Young India, his magazine, his weekly, placed that issue as of more importance than even the all-absorbing question of reforms. These are the constitutional reforms. This is how he concluded the issue. According to the above test of feeling for the weakest of ourselves as a measure of our capacity for self-government, this question of our countrymen in South Africa is of more immediate importance than even the all-absorbing question of reforms. That was the outlook of an Indian politician who had spent 21 years in South Africa and 1.5 years, I'm sorry, a little more, 4 years in India itself, in the political arena. In a congruence of consequence, the same issues coming to
many of them in
consider doing.
I know about
respect is more recognizable to us today as the color bar. It was a term that Gandhi used in South Africa and also later in India, national respect. And what he was handling at that moment in this respectful phraseology was color bar. And the color bar begins to play a sharper role as we go into the events in Kenya. And for immigration rights, this was the package of equal treatment. And those struggles against a racist settler presence, abetted by a colonial governor and his administration, who were more sympathetic with the settlers, all these, the confrontation between the Kenya-Indian politicians, the settlers, the government, and London, all these were at an advanced stage in Kenya, with the imperial government in London already also involved, and a determination of this question by the imperial government in London was in the offing. To Gandhi, this presented an opportunity. Firstly, these were also exactly the battles that Gandhi had identified and then fought in South Africa for 21 years. These were exactly, apart from immigration, the battles that Congress was now identifying as India's next step. But more intriguingly, Gandhi was also becoming emotionally involved. He would fight this one not to obtain any privileges for Indians in Kenya, but to secure the rights they should have from being whittled down, and more to prevent another white supremacist dominion in Africa, something that was also looming in nearby southern Rhodesia, and something he had failed to do in South Africa. He would prevent another substantial Indian population falling under a formerly white racial government. This too he had failed to do in South Africa. His view now was that this was an opportunity for India in respect of the issues of equal treatment and national respect. And this is the reasoning. For if Indians in a British colony in the empire in Africa succeeded in winning equal treatment with British settlers there, then the principle of equal treatment within the empire would be won throughout the empire, including India. Was shared by the Working Committee of Congress and Congress itself. Now, it is important to realize if these events which are taking place in 1919, and these are Gandhi's views in 1919, it is, if these events were taking place within the next, after 5 years, Gandhi's word in the Working Committee was total. His control over Congress was total. But in 1919, he did not command this amount of power really within Congress. And so when I say that this was a view shared by the Working Committee, it is a Working Committee which was not composed of people he had put there. Tilak is still alive, and there are the senior leaders within Congress still very much in control of the Congress. Gandhi is a 40-plus newcomer, respected, but yet to prove himself. And 1919 and the years that followed, 2021, are the beginning of, as he himself says, I showed that I could be useful to the Congress. And so he was now putting forward views that he had to convince the leaders about. Fortunately, or unfortunately, they too saw it as an opportunity to win equal rights for Indians everywhere, including India, by winning the battle in Kenya. The fight against the weak offerings, really, of an ungrateful crown in the form of the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Now, this is what is going on in India. And events such as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, April 1919, the Rowlatt Acts, the crawling orders, the Punjab sedition cases would continue in India. So what Gandhi was saying was that South Africa should have priority, East Africa now should have priority, not that the other objectives should be abandoned. But Gandhi and Congress now considered that the Indian struggles in Kenya were an opportunity to progress to success on the equal treatment front, so that Kenya was not only of relevance, but qualified for Congress's intervention and mobilization in Kenya. Reflecting this thinking, the Congress supporter C.F. Andrews put this thinking in this way: the question of equal treatment in India will be tried in the colonies. This is how their approach was. Raja Gopalachari recalled later, after 1923, that for the Congress, the decision on the Kenya Indians' demands for equal treatment was the acid test, because it would enable the same demand to go through more easily in India. Now, ironically, the Congress view was confirmed by the white settlers' own viewpoint in opposition. The Congress view that success for the Indians in Kenya would mean success for India itself was precisely one of the grounds of opposition by the settlers, and a ground for actually the removal of the Indian presence in Kenya through the immigration laws. The governor, Correndon, in his cable in February of 1923, I'm moving a little ahead, to the new colonial secretary, Devonshire, set out the settler view thus: any real victory for the Indian race in Africa will mean similar, very probably even larger claims in British Guyana, Fiji, and possibly elsewhere, not excepting Natal or even India itself. So that this Congress policy is a real motor which moved Congress to intervene in Kenya, which actually was that intervention being led by Gandhi and C.F. Andrews, Reverend Andrews, in there. Now, the settlers were immediately after the war, as the Kenya Indians' demands re-emerged after 1918, moved quickly in respect of two things. There was unity among the white settler organizations to present a memorandum to the Colonial Office in London. And in this memorandum, the settler leaders, Delamere and others, set out the reasons why Indians should not get any parity in relation to the franchise or to the White Highlands and so on. And amongst these was the view of the settlers that these Indian settlers were not hygienic enough, that their morals were terrible, and that their influence upon the country was not really a favorable one for the country itself. Immediately after that, the government then said they were going to look into the economic aspects, and the Economic Commission, the Commission on the Economic Aspects in Kenya, was then set in. So it was very clear to the settlers that this was not a Kenyan municipal conflict. This was a conflict which would have ramifications through the whole of Africa, and particularly in South Africa, throughout the empire, and in India itself. Gandhi responded. Now, when I say Gandhi, I do mean Gandhi, because it is not a euphemism for Congress, or this was a person who was highly respected because he had already led his experience of leading political struggles against white supremacist governments and movements had already been tested and admired. That his experience of satyagraha in South Africa on these issues was respected. That his judgment on these aspects had been lauded by Gokhale, and so on. So he was an active leader in this respect. And he sent Andrews there. On arrival at Mombasa, Andrews himself, in the welcoming ceremonies said, quote, "I have been specially asked by Mr. Gandhi to come out to Africa, and I had done so at first with very great reluctance, because most urgent and pressing matters were calling me to remain in India." And also, a little later, Mr. Abdul Rasul, Aladdin Avisram's son, who was the then president of the Indian Association, sent a telegram to Gandhi, quote, "Indian Association records deep, heartfelt gratitude for sparing Mr. Andrews from Punjab." The Andrews arrived in December 1919 and began a series. He was an extremely conscientious and extremely industrious worker for Gandhi. He entered immediately into a large number of interviews and travels within Kenya, and his integrity, his independence of mind was highly respected. He interviewed across the political opinions and so on. And in 1920, in June of 1920, published privately his book, Indians in Kenya. He rebutted all the arguments of this memorandum and the Economic Commission report from the settlers. He pointed out the conflict of interest of having the same persons in reporting as if they were independent people in the Economic Commission, and so on. And all these were, these rebuttals were reflected in and published in Young India. Gandhi had taken over Young India after the Bombay Chronicle and Horniman had been deported, and used it in precisely the way he had done Indian opinion in South Africa. In relation to this, apart from rebutting the issues on the morals of the Indians and their poor hygiene, the major issue was immigration. And what the settlers wanted was a push that enabled the statutes to contain enough powers for the arbitrary deportation of persons already within the country and the arbitrary refusal of persons entering into the country. And of course, this was targeted solely at the Indian immigration things. Now, this issue of immigration was not again a Kenya matter. By this time, there were about 1.2 million Indians overseas throughout the empire, firstly under indentured labor from 1838 onwards, and of private emigration, mostly of merchants. And there, the settlements were from Fiji in the east, the South Pacific, Malaya, coming into Mauritius, South Africa, Reunion, and then into the West Indies. And so, if the right to control Indian immigration by the dominions was not an abstract right, it was a right targeted against the presence and the increasing presence of Indians. And so in the Commonwealth, the dominions had held a conference in which this issue was extremely prominent. And the dominions, particularly pushed by South Africa, but very quietly, but as insistently by Australia on their White Australia plank, and the Canadians as well, to make sure that the right of the dominions to control immigration was independent of London and the Imperial Cabinet. That was established, and the settlers in Kenya were using this right to say that that what we are asking is not only lawful, but is the statutory provision throughout the empire. Andrews rebutted this by showing that within the decisions made at the Commonwealth Dominions Conference was a provision that British Indian citizens already domiciled in a self-governing colony shall receive as far as possible equal treatment. So this was going on, and Andrews was the voice of the overseas Indians, And this was conveyed to Gandhi, and Gandhi did use this information in two directions. One, through Young India as a journal of record, and secondly, conveying this material and the rebuttals and the statutory qualifications, etc., to persons of influence in Britain. By now, by 2021, Gandhi had gathered a large amount of influence in British public opinion makers in Britain. Among these were sympathetic members of parliament. There were church missionary bodies, CMS, LMS, and so on. And Andrews came from the missionary bodies. So that Gandhi had contacts and was able to convey these views deep into the British circles, decision-making circles. When these reports came in Young India, Gandhi commented on the material that Andrews sent. And one of the major things, of course, was the removal of Undesirables Bill 1919. And that, of course, as I said, was aimed directly at Indian immigration. And if this passed, then there were no reasons need be given by the governor for deporting any person or of refusing entry to any person. And this is, so Andrews sent a telegram to Gandhi saying that the bill is now being published. This is what Gandhi says. Hardly any comment is necessary on this cablegram. There is a dead set against the Indian settler in East Africa. The proposed ordinance, the statute, is in my humble opinion most mischievous in character and leaves every Indian at the mercy of an executive subservient to the interested European agitator against the Indians. The unscrupulous nature of the agitation is manifest from the utterly false charges. I regard the proposed ordinance as the first definite legal step towards the reduction of the Indians to complete servility. He has dared to claim an equal status with the recently arrived European settler. He has dared to dispute the haughty position taken up by his European rival in trade. The latter has captured the executive. I mentioned this in connection with what I submitted earlier, was the emotional attachment displayed by Gandhi in his response to the events that are going on in Kenya and the conduct of the white settlers. Gandhi's dislike for his settler opponents, as well as their politics, is again reflected in his sharp responses, only just short of open rudeness. The situation was one that Gandhi had regularly faced in South Africa, but there he had not made such responses, such comments. There he had rationally rebutted such positions in his publication, Indian Opinion, and had often moved to negotiations, such as the Gandhi Smuts Agreement. In the Kenya case, he does not do so, directly or indirectly through Andrews or London. He is clear that he will not do so. This is how he continues that comment. Quote, the East African position admits of no compromise such as was possible in South Africa, where the condition was totally different from the East African condition. But Gandhi does not give any reason or reasons why he says so, nor why and how the condition is totally different, preventing him from following the path he had followed before and after. Without such reasons, it is an odd statement to make. This is not Gandhi's normal course of conduct. The Gandhi-Irwin Pact, for example, of later years, very soon, also shows this. I venture to suggest that the emotional engagement and great dislike were bringing this about, a situation which Gandhi himself would have considered unworthy of a true satyagrahi. This extensive reportage and concern about immigration reflected the intense push by the white settlers to clear the way, to realize their wish for self-rule, where the only stumbling block was the presence of the Indians and their political agitation against it, and for equal rights. But both could be removed by the enactment of this ordinance, and these were now the issues that were going for decision to London by the imperial government, the very issues that would bring equal treatment to India. And in 1922, end of 1922, and early in 1923, matters came to a head as the colonial secretary, who until then was Winston Churchill, changed to Lord Devonshire with the change of government from liberal to conservative. And the new colonial secretary called a deputation of the settlers to come and address him, speak to him about it. He also called an Kenya Indian delegation. And he also called an Indian delegation. And he also called the Government of India delegation. And Andrews went as part of the Indian delegation. The churches were involved, and so on. And this was the push to a determination of the contending forces within Kenya. On 25th July 1923, the new colonial secretary finally issued the white paper, Indians in Kenya, and his decision was set out as follows on those contentious questions. Quote, this is the famous Devonshire Declaration. Primarily, Kenya is an African territory, and His Majesty's government think it is necessary definitely to record their considered opinion that the interest of the African natives must be paramount, and that if and when those interests and the interests of the immigrant races should conflict, the former should prevail. But in the administration of Kenya, His Majesty's government regard themselves as exercising a trust on behalf of the African population, and they are unable to delegate or share this trust, the object of which may be defined as the protection and advancement of the native races. This is the famous command paper. I'll first speak on the reaction in India and then on the reaction in Kenya. In India, the declaration came as a shock. The declaration came, and I quote Rajagopalachari, as a shock because for Congress and other Indian political opinion, the decision on the Kenya Indians' demands for equal treatment were the acid test. This is a repetition of what I said earlier. This reaction in India showed the key importance that Congress and the struggle in India had attached to the Indian settler conflict in Kenya. The reaction reflected the then given view that the conflict in Kenya would resolve the ongoing issues of equality and national respect in India itself. The decision was seen, therefore, not just as a decision on Indians in Kenya, but as a decision on Indians throughout the empire and on Indians in India itself. Rajagopalachari continues, quote, "The Imperial Parliament has accepted the cabinet decision on Kenya, which lays down a general policy for the whole empire." So that India and Congress had seen from 1919 onwards, under the leadership of Gandhi and of his own conviction, that the struggle there and the decision on it would lay down a general policy for the whole empire. When the white paper was published, Gandhi was in prison. He had been sentenced in, I think, 1921 or early 22, and remained in prison till 1924. In his absence, Rajagopalachari was acting as the editor of Young India. And Young India carried 3 editorials on the Devonshire Declaration in August, again in August, and again in September, and also carried Andrew's report on the consequences of Kenya. Historian Robert Gregory, who's written on India and East Africa, concluded, I quote, "In India, the chief effect of the Devonshire Declaration was to disillusion the moderate wing as to the value of retaining a close association with Britain." Mr. Shastri, who was a Government of India appointment for Indians overseas, saw the cabinet decision, and I quote, "as a profound humiliation and the deepest affront to India." Again, Rajagopalachari, "It is to the moderates that the meaning of Kenya has come with the shock of stupefaction. The comforting postulates on which they had built up their political philosophy have been destroyed. To them, indeed, Kenya was the acid test." He repeats himself. "India has no place in the empire, and the empire can have no place for India." So the Devonshire Declaration, a step in Kenya's history, was the trigger in bringing about a sea change in India's history. And moving from equality within the empire to the unification of huge numbers of Indians behind the demand for a break with the empire and complete independence. When we speak about moderates, we are not referring to persons more moderate than Gandhi, although Gandhi is a leader sui generis. The contrast were the extremists, so-called, such as Bhagat Singh, and those who felt that it was important not to eliminate the use of violence in the struggle for freedom. But moderates involved all the persons who were then leaders in Congress. And it was this, the Devonshire Declaration shook this bloc. And so this is how Congress reacted. In September 23rd, remember that the Devonshire Declaration is July 25th, Congress convened a special session at Delhi to debate the Kenya issue. In fact, end quote, a resolution urging separation from the British Empire was moved, but it was rejected by Gandhi, Motilal Nehru, and other elder statesmen who were still not prepared to commit Congress to a final break. This is Hugh Tinker. Again, Rajagopalachari, speaking for Gandhi through Young India, in another editorial says, "The meaning of Kenya is a challenge. the challenge to make ourselves free. And the ourselves are Indians. Lord Reading, Viceroy, also warned London of this effect. He said, indignation and disappointment is shared by all classes and parties in India, including those who have usually been our strong supporters to stay within the empire. I doubt whether you or His Majesty's government realize the national humiliation which is implied in the decision. I trust that you and His Majesty's government understand the difficulty in future of impressing upon the Indians the benefit they derive from associating with the empire. They were immediately after the Devonshire Declaration, for about a year, steps were taken to ameliorate, to renegotiate, to ask the government to change the mind. Gandhi took no significant part in these post-decision discussions, but he continued to publish major articles in Young India on Kenya in the years that followed, firstly for the rest of 1923, and then 24, 25, 26. As examples of this, in 1923, he writes, these are articles by Andrews, the Kenya Highlands, covering the flogging and torture to death of a settler's employee, the white man's trust on forced labor and hut tax in India. Again, 1923, African labor in Kenya. Again, 1923, Kenya and Kilimanjaro on settler plans to extend settler dominations into Tanganyika despite it being a mandated territory. Harry Thuku of Kenya, the lowlands of Kenya, miscarriage of justice in Kenya. So that although the decision had come out in mid-1923, Gandhi did not stop publishing and exposing. It was a spotlight upon settler and colonial government misconduct in Kenya, and he continued doing that, although now Congress, Gandhi, Andrews, Tagore, all of the leadership is changing, in moving away now from the settlement of equal treatment in India by reference to struggles in Kenya and elsewhere. By 1928, Congress's view of a break with Britain had become part of its formal and publicly stated policy. And now see, Motilal Nehru, who was president of the Congress that year, stated in his presidential address that the best way they could help Indians overseas was to take action to gain our freedom here. The same person who in 1923, and the same people, same leadership, who in 1923 were not willing to make a break, were now in these years had shifted totally over, and Congress was now committed to this. And just to give you a much later statement, but more as explicit, in 1936, Jawaharlal Nehru, in his report to Congress, says, quote, "Our countrymen abroad must realize that the key to their problems lies in India. They rise or they fall with the rise and fall of India." And that was the exact opposite of what the 1919, 1920, 1921, 22, and 23 position was. That India would rise and fall with the rise and fall in the colonies, particularly South Africa and Kenya, but more especially in Kenya. So these were the reactions. And what we see is this, that these positions that the Devonshire Declaration affected India-Britain relations, and thereby Indian history took a new direction. And that happened by reason of Kenya's history. Gandhi and Congress had not been helping the Indians achieve their political goals. This was Congress acting in Indian politics to achieve India's own political goals. I turn to the reaction in Kenya. The Kenyan Indians had fought for two goals. Firstly, for equal rights, and secondly, against settler self-rule. They failed in the first. They did not get equal rights. And because the law and settler attitudes did not change, nor did they need to be changed immediately, the Indians thought that they had failed in the second goal as well. They thought that thus they had totally lost, that they had won nothing, that their sustained opposition had achieved nothing. But history renders another verdict. One, that sustained opposition and Gandhi's had denied self-rule to the white settlers. And two, that the success of the Kenya Indians in denying self-rule to the settlers was the biggest achievement of the political activity of the Indians in pre-independent Kenya. The white settlers saw this clearly, and a historian, Murray Brown, writing on Kenya, deemed it a crushing rebuff to the settlers. So that the conclusion that emerged out of the Devonshire Declaration took a bigger impact on India and a lesser impact on Kenya. And although, if I may sum up what happened in Kenya by reason of it, the Kenya-Indian political struggle within Kenya had ensured ultimately that Kenya did not go the southern Rhodesian Zimbabwean way, with a UDI by the white settler population, used to formal self-rule, and a civil war and independence delayed by 20 years or more. It prevented, secondly, a federation of white colonies in Africa, again on the model of the Central African Federation. And thirdly, it delayed a union of white South Africa, white Central Africa, and white East Africa into becoming another reality. It delayed it and thereby made it politically unviable as African nationalism began to push there. A second response by the Kenya Indians also involved in Gandhi and Congress. As a result of the Devonshire Declaration, the East African Indian National Congress resolved that the Kenyan Indians would suspend payment of the poll tax until the Devonshire decisions were modified. A resolution against this was tabled at the next annual meeting of the East African Congress at Mombasa. Quote, in view of the unjust and ubiquitous Kenya decision of the 25th July, Congress resolves that as a protest against the main decision, payment of poll tax by Indians in Kenya, excepting government servants, should be suspended as a first step until the modification of the said decisions. Now, following on this resolution, which was passed overwhelmingly, it was decided also to organize a satyagraha against the poll tax law. To that end, Mr. M.A. Desai, the foremost political leader of the Indians in Kenya till today, traveled to India for support. And again, Gandhi's Young India reports his efforts, quote, the local Indian leaders had thought of starting this satyagraha as a form of direct action against the Kenya government decision. M.A. Desai, the Indians' leader, put this idea before a meeting of the working committee held at Sabarmati in the end of November 1923. The committee seemed to be quite skeptical about the advisability of starting such a movement. And again, Mr. Rajagopalachari cross-examined Mr. Desai at length about the number of people that would be involved, the probable amount of suffering they would have to undergo, the morale of the Indians in Kenya, and similar points. Mr. Desai placed before the working committee the information that he had and wanted advice from them. The committee definitely refused to give any advice on this point and decided to send one of their representatives to Kenya to attend the Congress, East African Indian Congress, and to study the situation. The working committee thus did not consider the Kenyan Indians sufficiently prepared for an effective satyagraha, though there were those on the committee who were sympathetic to the idea of assistance to them. And it sets out. Several Kenyan Indians went to prison for this, and the satyagraha never took place. That is how Sarojini Naidu first came to Kenya and took the presidentship of the Congress in January 1925. The Devonshire Declaration moved the Kenyan Indians' political activity into a new dimension. It diluted not only the intensity of their political work, but it brought disunity into the Indian Congress, East African Indian Congress. A path which, through their resulting confusion, brought about by the declaration, the failure of the intended satyagraha, and the change in Congress policy in Kenya. Because now, as the Congress in India moved into other directions, total Swaraj, total independence, break with Britain, Kenya was no longer part of the agenda. Although at every single yearly annual Congress, the issue of overseas Indians was always on the agenda and resolutions were always passed. But that intense push by Gandhi and Congress from 1919 to 23 was no longer present. But the direction was charted for them by Sarojini Naidu in her president's speech. This is what she said to the East African Indians, quote, "The future lies with the Africans, but your part is not to betray them by betraying your rights." And though there was no further direct Indian involvement in Kenyan affairs by Congress till 1947, it brought about shared political activity between Africans and Indians in Kenya in the coming decades, although there was no major Indian political activity save by individuals like Pio Pinto or Makhan Singh. Shared influence arose between them and over the years, and one of them was, importantly, the example and the ideals of the Indian independence movement, which I'll come to in a while, and the Gandhi-Nehru assault on the concept of colonialism. I come to the time after the Devonshire Declaration, after 1925 now, and because what was happening was, as the intensity of the independence struggle in India grew, by 1929, Gandhi's focus had moved completely away from the colonies, from Africa. 1930 was the Dundee March, 1931 was the Round Table, and then a continuous succession of crises right up to Quit India and finally the partition. And so Gandhi did not look back to Africa again. But there are postscripts to warm our hands on. When, 2 years later, from 1929, in 1931, when Kenyatta returned to England in May 1931 to present views to the British Parliament's Joint Select Committee on Closer Union, he met up with Andrews, by then in Britain. Both men were frequent visitors to the house of William McGregor Ross. Ross had served as a civil servant in Kenya. In 1931, Gandhi was in England for the second Indian Roundtable Conference. Late in the year, in October, Andrews and Ross arranged a meeting between Kenyatta and Gandhi before Gandhi left to return to India. They brought Gandhi up to date on the African political activity in Kenya, and at the end of the meeting, Gandhi wrote and signed a message in Kenyatta's 1931 diary. It reads, quote, "Truth and non-violence can deliver any nation from bondage." Under these lines, Kenyatta wrote, "Meeting with Mahatma Gandhi," followed by his full signature, Jomo Kenyatta. The influence of the Indian independence movement and India's independence itself was a major factor or thinking and values of all the Kenya Indians in the following decades. And it was also a major factor in the African independence movements of the 40s, 50s, 60s. And Nelson Mandela, writing on Gandhi after his release in 1991, 90 and thereafter, wrote that Gandhi's influence remained throughout the 60s on the continent. Gandhi never went back to Africa over the years that followed, although it did not wholly leave his thoughts. In 1926, writing, he said, "There is a strong tie binding the colonial-born Indian to me." And this was evidenced also by what President Obama recently referred to as Gandhi's, and I quote, "attention to the marginalized voices in Africa." This was, of course, a reference to the Tamil labor, which he found in 1893. And that helped Gandhi, says President Obama, gather a movement that that drove out the world's most successful empire. And so the influence of Gandhi remained constant. There was such a tie. In 1939, he wrote a letter to his old friend in South Africa, Velshi Keshavji, and he writes in Gujarati. And he starts the letter, if I may convey it in Gujarati first, he says, "Mara Keshavji." And it's very difficult to translate that in English. It doesn't mean my Keshavji, it doesn't mean my dear Keshavji, because they mean different things. It was something very close between them. And he writes, and that's a very poignant start, and then he writes, it's 1939. "I have kept your letter of 13th of August 1938. Today I was going through my old correspondence in the train when I came across your letter. You have rightly said that the situation here is very grave." He's writing from Sabarmati, from Wardha. "Believe me, I'm the same person as I was there. I'm prepared to achieve Hindu-Muslim unity even if I have to die. What can I say about the situation there in South Africa, as I cannot guide our brethren from here? I keep an eye on your situation all the time. Certainly write to me. God bless you. Blessings from Bapu, Sevagram, Wardha." It is not only a wistful recall of old friends, but also for a recall of a time when politics was simpler for him, and he had led against and fought external enemies, while now deeper divisions and partitions from within were tearing at his life's work. This was also reflected in another letter that he wrote in 1940 to a correspondent in Masaka. This is what he wrote to Abdullah Ismail, an advocate practicing in a small town in Uganda. My dear Ismail, 23rd March 1940, I promised to send you a message. Here it is. I hope that in East Africa at least, you will never allow the communal poison to kill society. The Friends of the Students' Federation never wrote to me. Yours sincerely, M.K. Gandhi. It is a message that is as applicable to East Africa now as it was to India then. And finally, though he never went back to Africa, in a way he did. On Gandhi's death in 1948, the connection with Africa was reaffirmed. From his cremation at Rajghat in Delhi, a part of the ashes, the major portion of which, of course, were cast in the Ganges, were also to be taken to South Africa. They were to be carried by Mr. Sorabji Rustamji. Both Sorabji and his father, referred to in Gandhi's South African writings as the Parsi Rustamji, were political associates and close family friends of Gandhi. On the way from Bombay to South Africa, the steamer carrying Mr. Sorabji Rustamji docked in Mombasa for several days. He was met there by his close friend, Mr. Jamshed Beramji of Nairobi. Mr. Beramji remembered later, when Rustamji's ship stopped at Mombasa on the way back, homage was paid to the ashes in Mombasa. The urn was then brought to Nairobi and placed in the Desai Memorial Hall for one day, where again the public, including the then governor of Kenya, Sir Philip Mitchell, paid their respects. Upon the return of the urn to Mombasa, Mr. Beramji requested Mr. Rustamji to allow part of the ashes to be left behind in East Africa so that they could be immersed at the source of the Nile. Mr. Rustamji agreed to this. Accordingly, some of the ashes were then put in a new urn and left behind, while Mr. Rustamji proceeded to South Africa with the remainder. There, those ashes were immersed at the confluence of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean outside Cape Town. The new urn, containing the ashes left behind at Mombasa, was then taken to Nairobi, and from there the ashes were taken by road to Uganda. Soon, other cars joined the convoy, and the journey took 7 days instead of 2, because at every township on the way, people stopped the convoy and gathered to pay their respects, and the procession had to stop each time. Upon finally reaching Kampala, there was again a formal ceremony of homage, attended also by the governor of Uganda. The ashes were then taken to Jinja on the 14th of August 1948, on the eve of the first anniversary of independence. Before a huge crowd gathered on the riverbank, the ashes of Mahatma Gandhi were immersed in the source of the river Nile. The honor of immersing the ashes in the Nile was given to Mr. Ram Bilas Sirdar, a highly respected social worker of great integrity, as befitting Gandhi's ideals of public service. And so again, by another unlikely turn of events, Gandhi's close association with East Africa was again echoed in that last journey through Kenya and Uganda and the Nile. And in searching about Gandhi, I found Indian history in Kenya and Kenyan history in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Feroz, for reminding us at a moment in time when we were not restricted by our imaginations and our politics were not restricted by lines on a map. and the emancipatory potential thinking across these lines offers to us. We can take maybe a couple of questions before we break for the reception. I also want to take something to thank Dr. Kasturi Gupta and Amar Al-Haider for organizing this event. Are there any questions? Siddharth. Yes, the recording.
All right, thanks very much for your talk. That was absolutely fascinating. I had a question about how membership of empire is being conceptualized. And it was quite interesting to me that one is using the idea of Indian settlers, like a settler being a word that's often simply used in a sort of racially bounded way to only apply to white settlers. And I'm curious about the ways in which Indian people think of themselves as agents of empire who are carrying forward a sort of imperializing mission. And also equally this language, I think you quoted Andrews saying that the question of parity for Indians will be decided in the colonies, which seems to suggest to some extent that India is being imagined as some kind of sub-imperial metropole in relation to the African colonies. So if you could just address some of these issues, and maybe even the possibility of comparison with spaces such as Palestine, where you have other non-white populations becoming settler populations to some extent. Thank you.
Can we just take another question and then maybe Feroz can answer? Maybe you want to just address this one?
Sure, certainly. The settlers in the Indian settlers in South Africa, in East Africa, in Trinidad, etc., were not carrying forward an imperializing mission at all. They came there in a form which was very close to the system that they had replaced of slavery. And the conditions in which the indentured labor lived in Fiji and for example, in South Africa were not conditions which gave them any sympathy with their rulers. They did not themselves use the term settlers. Ironically, it's Gandhi who constantly pointed out that the Indians were in Kenya long before the British settlers came in. And that is where he uses the term settlers in respect of the Indian immigrants. The settlement of Indians in East Africa breaks up into two. One part, the early merchants, seasonal visitors, and later permanent residents there. And secondly, the indentured laborers. And the difference is that the first merchant settlements were only at the coast, although Aladdin Visram had a huge empire inland as well of shops. The second wave was what took the Indians up country, and that was the indentured labor used in the building of the railways. So that they do not see themselves, and this has to be separated because there is a lot of Indian writing that praises the empire, both in India, in East Africa, or anywhere else, South Africa and so on. And you have to place it within its time frame and say what was the political thinking of the person who's writing, and was this reflective of a position of the whole of the settlers. So that there are people who seek to use those not only to say that the writers are praising the empire, but that they are praising the empire for using, let's say, Tamil labor or Punjabi labor for building the railway, or that these are people who can who flourish under the empire. And you have supervisors, you have kapos who throughout all ruling groups using such persons. So it is not that. Membership of the empire was to distinguish between an even lower status, which was you are a nobody in the empire, and you will do what we say. If we say build a canal, you build a canal. If we say we want cheap labor for white settlers or sugar plantations in the West Indies, that is you, and so on. So this is an attempt to say that you cannot, on the one hand, have a king, emperor, who is saying, I rule I'm a benevolent and I rule this the largest empire, etc., for the good of the people. And yet you say it is perfectly all right if to discriminate against these people and say the well-to-do among them cannot buy farms which whites should have, or that somebody who is, for example, Nehru, Harrow and Cambridge, had no vote in India when he came back. So are you going to apply the concept that this is a state of affairs which the empire is actually practicing? No, it was not. Are you going to apply Cecil Rhodes things for all civilized men? Right? So no women, no definition of civilized, and how are you going to judge who should be treated how? And that is why later on I'm sorry that I didn't touch upon the thing, but both Andrews and Gandhi, who had never spoken in these ways, come to define the disappointment not only of the Devonshire Declaration, but of a whole series of conduct as as the color problem. And so and that is what Redding is saying, humiliation and so on. So this is how you say, I am a lawyer, a Gujarati lawyer in South Africa, and I'm addressing a British government which says that we uphold reason, we uphold justice, and we uphold the equality of all the subjects under the emperor. And Gandhi says, well, show us. And so we are also members of this empire. That is how. So that you get language which is consistent with what they were thinking then, and they moved away from this eventually. And the Devonshire Declaration was a blow to anybody who seriously thought that this was the only way. And also, if I may say so, which I didn't, exactly at the time, the Devonshire Declaration and the Kenya Indians' work, struggle there, and Congress and Gandhi putting support there, did not in any way stop the Indian struggle from carrying on. Exactly at that time, 1921-23, the Khilafat movement is on. The first major satyagraha, 1921-22, which he then called off, was going on exactly at that time. So it is clear that Gandhi had not been to Yale. He was quite capable of chewing gum and conducting 3 or 4 campaigns all at the same time.
This is reference to some of our other alumni. If there are, I know there are more questions. We'll continue this over the reception, which is on the 2nd floor. Dinner is being served. Please feel free to come up and talk to Feroz. He'll also be here tomorrow. And he's speaking to some of the students at the African Council at lunch. So if anyone's interested to listen to Feroz talk about current events in Kenya, that's the event to go. Thank you again.